thesis project, however, was titled Community, the World War II Homefront and POW Art, the St. Mary's Project in Umbarger, Texas. So she has kind of lived this St. Mary's Project in lots of different ways. And she's going to be attending the Public History PhD program at Middle Tennessee State University beginning this fall. So she will be continuing on with that path. In the center is Dr. Amy von Lintel. Amy has a BA in Art History, French, and European Studies from the University of Kansas. She has an MA in Art History from SMU here in Texas. She received her PhD in Art History from the University of Southern California. At WTAMU, here she is the Professor of Art History and the Director of Gender Studies, and she's also published lots of books and articles on the art history of the region, and teaches classes that draw from the art resources of this area, including the Painted Church in Umbarger that we'll talk about. And finally, but certainly not least, is Warren Stricker. Warren holds degrees from the University of Colorado and the University of Texas at Austin. Warren has worked as an archivist in Texas for over 30 years. Calm down, Deana. And he is the director of the PPHM Research Center and has held that position since 2008. I am really excited to be able to have this conversation, not just with my colleagues, but also with my friends. So I want to start, Warren, I know you don't like the hot seat, but you get to start. I want you to tell us a little bit about your impetus for the exhibition that's just around the corner, how it came to be, and kind of your thoughts in putting all of that together.
Yes, well, thank you. And first of all, thank you all for coming tonight. I'm very gratified to see the number of folks that are here tonight, and I think it speaks to the importance of this series of events that took place in the Texas Panhandle and the connections that we still have with it. The exhibition, and again, if you haven't had a chance to see it, it's in the Alexander Gallery, just over to this part of the building. It began in 2020 when we were contacted by a gentleman living in Arizona named Charlie Osborne, who said that he had some papers that had belonged to his mother, who was from the Hereford area and had to do with her experience during World War II and at the Hereford POW camp, and would we be interested in having those items? And we said, yes, of course we would, and he sent us a few photos, which were amazing. And then when we finally did get the papers, when they came up from Arizona, we were just knocked out by the items. It's not a large collection. It consists of a few documents, some letters, and other printed items and other things related to the POW camp, some artifacts and drawings and paintings. And we were just astounded at, or I was certainly, when we received those items and just had no idea that such things could come out of such difficult circumstances. So we immediately thought that, oh yes, this would make a great exhibition. And so when we started planning that work, and when I say we, I should acknowledge Renee Dantes, who is also from our research center, who worked with me on this exhibition. How do we tell the story, or what will the story be that we tell? And of course, naturally, we wanted to put them in context and share the story of the POW camp and how they fit in with that story and the experience of the person who had them. And by the way, her name was Ann Cockrell. She was, as I said, from Hereford. She was born in 1922, so she was about 20 years old when the camp opened up. She'd had a couple of years of college and in some business classes, so she obtained a job in the Hereford camp and was there for the duration of its existence, from when it opened in early 1943 until it closed in 1946. She worked in the camp in the hospitals, but she worked with the doctors. They can take notes on notes for them and recording some of the proceedings that went on in the camp over those years and doing a variety of things, actually. And so she had received these items as part of her work with the camp. As I said, there were a number of the things were drawings and paintings, and these were works of art that were created by the prisoners at the camp. Also some artifacts, and you saw in the film some of the things that were created by the prisoners during their time there. So there are things like that. There were some pieces of jewelry, and again, that was also mentioned in the film. So we wanted to particularly feature those items, and when we were telling the story of the camp, the thing that came to mind to me immediately was, and again, you heard this in the film, the bonds of friendship that were established between people who worked there at the camp and the prisoners themselves. And when you think about it, these were difficult circumstances for everybody involved. Here were the people in Hereford who all of a sudden had this massive camp, almost like a small town that was suddenly appeared just a few miles away and filled with enemy soldiers, and they're thinking about their loved ones who are serving in the military, perhaps overseas, and all the anxieties and stresses that go along with the life during World War II. So, yet under those difficult circumstances, there were these bonds that were established between people of very different backgrounds, very different cultures, a language difference, religious differences, and so on. So.
Okay, I have to ask you a question, Warren.
Sure.
So we're talking about these relationships, and we're talking about the Anne. Anne is the kind of the impetus for this exhibition. It's her experience, and it's her objects and the things that she's collected through these personal relationships. But let's talk a little bit about this kind of duality of these relationships. This is something that kind of came up as we were watching the film, and it's something that I've come across in each of my conversations with the three of you. So let's talk about the kind of the multiple relationships and the kind of the multiple layers of relationships that these people were having. So we have prisoners, but these are not shackled prisoners. They're more political prisoners. They're far away from home. Michaela, can you speak to maybe those relationships in the church and how those kind of personal relationships with the women in the church were maybe in some ways the same as this relationship that Anne had as a camp, the POW camp employee, and then these volunteers?
Right. So in Umbarger, they were interacting on a one-on-one level with a lot of these women and occasionally some of the men. And that definitely helped create these more intimate relationships. And I think that the idea that they were being fed by these women brought them more into like a homey environment, and that also helped create those friendships.
Okay, so you've touched on a couple of really interesting points that I wanted to bring up. First of all, the idea that all of these relationships are built on really small personal moments. I think we see that in her relationship with Anne, Anne's relationship with the prisoners at the camp. We see that in the relationships at the St. Mary's Project at the church. But we're also talking about stories almost exclusively told from the perspective of women, with the exception of the priest Cruckert, am I pronouncing that correct? And the guard, Mr. Coyle, they're almost all from the perspective of women, which I find is interesting. We also see food being used as a currency. And people want to be fed. Go figure. Y'all had cookies out here. You know what that's like. Don't pretend you didn't. But food as currency is a theme that keeps coming back through that story. How do we reconcile this idea that people's rations were being cut, they were losing weight, and yet we're feeding them and we're having these kind of jovial times?
I think it's a cultural thing because living in Umbarger, all of our interactions are sort of centered around food. Like after church on Sunday, you go and get donuts and coffee and you sit and chat. So it's sort of this culture in Umbarger where food is important for connecting, and that was definitely brought in. And I do want to mention that, yes, we have lots of women telling stories, but we do have several men, some who are not mentioned in here. So we do have a good mix of things.
And that's from the perspective of somebody who's diving deep in the story, right?
Yes.
So if we want to take a look at this, we can look at it from one perspective, but research shows something different sometimes. So I think that's an interesting point, and I'm glad you brought that up. It is not exclusively the story of women. But
Deana, can I add something to
Absolutely, Amy. I was going to
So-
call on you next, so I'm glad you jumped
good.
right in.
Okay, yeah,
What do you wanna
jumping the
add?
gun. Something that Warren just said made me think, and I hadn't thought about it. I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be a prisoner or what it would have meant for them to be a prisoner. What you said, Warren, was that the people here in Hereford and Umbarger were thinking about their own sons and thinking about hoping someone would be kind to their sons if they were in a prison camp abroad. And I hadn't thought about that idea about, like, we're going to bestow kindness upon these young men, not because they're enemies of us, but because they're young men like our young men. That idea of, like, feeding someone who's a soldier that's a common soldier rather than someone orchestrating the war, like stepping out of that enemy role and into that young man role that you want to take care of, and maybe the mothering role too with the cooking for that. I don't know. I was just thinking about that like kindness and that reciprocity of kindness, hoping someone would do it for their young men too.
And that carries over to an idea that I made a point to write down as well. There is a panel in the exhibition, Warren, and I'm going to put you on the spot, but there is a quote that reads that these men were drafted the same as I. So this idea of a universality, I think, runs through the exhibition and through the St. Mary's Project. You want to talk a little bit more about that?
Right, and that quote actually does come from John Coyle. That was a quote that Donald Mace Williams, who was in the film and who donated his research papers to the museum, and which is a very valuable source for us. I think that's, again, as Amy said, I think that also goes the other way. These young Italian prisoners were probably, as they got out of the camp and worked on farms and had interactions with the local community, they probably looked at some of the men and women and reminded them of their parents and back home, and wondering what was happening to them in the midst of all of this strife and this turmoil. So, I think that sort of thing went both ways.
No, and I think that's a really interesting point. I think that the interaction within the community, being on farms and seeing the locations and interacting with people outside of the camp itself, although that was Anne's experience, that wasn't necessarily exclusively the experiences that people in this region had with the POWs. But Amy, I know you and I have had conversations about the regionality of the work in the church, so I'm hoping that you can talk a little bit about what the idea of regionality even is and how it conveys in this particular instance.
Sure. Actually, I'm going to draw on a colleague of mine that I sent some feedback to and asked some questions prior to this. And I asked him what he thought about the idea of this as a regional story. And sometimes regional kind of limits or pigeonholes something as not the mainstream, something out there or over there but not here. And I think what's so nice, I work on regional art all the time, and I never think of it as lesser or sideline. For me, it's the main story. But with this, what I love about it is that, yes, it's a story about a regional area, but it's also so highly international. These men were taken from North Africa, grew up in Italy. They were removed from North Africa and brought to a new desert. I kept asking, why is it called the desert? Well, he felt like it was the desert. It probably had more in common with Africa than it did with his home in Italy. Who knows?
Well, and this naming of the desert, as an O'Keeffe scholar, you'll appreciate this as well. The Amarillo Museum of Art has an O'Keeffe watercolor that has been renamed to Train Coming in Canyon, but it was originally Train in the Desert, Train at Night in the Desert. Somebody else gave it that name, this idea of this place being a desert.
And the idea that it resembles North Africa is actually pretty on point, because the Geneva Convention stipulated that wherever the prisoners were picked up is the same environment that they had to go. was one of those stipulations.
Weren't they lucky they got picked up in Africa and got to come to the Panhandle? Yay. Okay, let's go back to this idea of regionality for just a minute. And then, Michaela, I want to talk to you some more about the actual artwork in the church. So, Amy, let's finish that thought about, okay, well, never mind.
Just the idea that the regional is not isolated, we know this. It is connected to the national stories of the war and the global stories of the war. And so, I'm working on an honors class for next semester that's called something like, I don't know, the global art history of the Panhandle. And this is the kind of thing that we're really interested in, the Panhandle to the world,
And that's kind of the point that I wanted to tease out of that conversation, that I think often we think that the Panhandle is really isolated and kind of encapsulated in and of itself. And I think that when we look at especially the art and historical contexts of this region, we find that we've been influenced by and are influencing lots of other movements. I mean, from, POW camps to, Ed Ruscha and, before and after and continuing. So I think it's an interesting context. But speaking of the art, okay, Michaela, let's talk a little bit about the art and kind of the symbolism and some of the kind of the ways in which these creative, artistic prisoners were influencing the interior of the space, making design decisions, making interesting choices, making statements in the work that they're putting into the interior.
So Dino Gambetti was the master artist, in my opinion, was the master artist. He did all of the drawings, and Cantanetti, and DeBello just followed all of his designs. So Dino Gambetti is our main artist. He was not a religious artist by training. He was an abstract, futurist artist, if you will. So he had no religious iconography training, and he drew inspiration from a Roman missal that was already in the church. So he took these ideas that were already in the church, insulated, that people didn't get to see, because the Roman missal is something that the priest looks at during Mass. So the people don't get to see this Roman missal. So Dino Gambetti took those images and put them up on the walls for the rest of the world to see. And so it's a 1923 missal, and you can see exact, like almost direct copies of these images being put on the walls.
And it's incredible if you can literally compare side by side different panels within the church and illustrations within the missal. But I know there's some other imagery that doesn't come from the missal. Do you want to tell us about that?
There are lots of fascism connections. Like on the on the front wall behind the statues of Mary and Jesus, there's this Byzantine cross pattern in the background, which they put purposefully to draw connections to the swastika. There's also on the choir loft balcony, there are some connections to Mussolini. There's a monograph M, which would have been a monograph of Mussolini. There's a very similar one that we see in the Italiano Forco, I think is how we say it. And then on one side is the lion, which was Mussolini's astrological sign. And then on the other side, there's eagle, which is a sign of Imperial Rome.
Okay, so these symbols take me a couple of different places. First of all, I'm thinking, is that, and we'll get to this in a minute, was this intentional? Did they just see something and kind of subconsciously incorporate these elements in? But then these POWs came back more than once and brought their families and came back to the church. So, Michaela, was it intentional or was it accidental?
I know for a fact that the Byzantine cross and the swastika reference was intentional, because when they came back in 1986, Franco de Bello told Harvey, Normaline Artho, yes, we did that. We did it as a lark. It was a joke. The others, however, I think since he'd never actually stated that they did that on purpose was maybe more of a subconscious thing, or since nobody pointed it out, he didn't feel the need to explain that?
So in the creation of the St. Mary's Project, there are lots of elements in the art that were intentional. The swastika kind of being embedded in this other imagery. There's some references, and Amy, maybe you can speak to this, about being able to see the farm kind of off in the distance, and that's incorporated in some of the imagery as well. Would you like to speak on that?
Yeah, I think this idea of like putting a SWAT. I didn't do it.
Yeah, that's how my day has gone. I'm sorry,
Well, and
everybody.
saying the word swastika and then having it do that, like, okay, that is perfect. But I think embedding the swastika, and somehow it doesn't seem like they're making light of that. I think instead they're telling a story of the war. Like it's a symbol that is part of their narrative, even if they don't adopt Nazism. Because, I mean, is there any evidence that they were Nazis?
I mean, they were fascists,
Yeah.
but not
Right.
Nazis, which is different.
But there's something about putting that symbol in there that tells a story that is layered and multiple meanings. And I think that's true about the art too. Michaela and I went back and forth about, we want to do an art history project of this art. And so one of the things we ask ourselves in our history is about quality. What makes these good works of art? And the story around them is amazing. No one's arguing that. But really, are they as beautiful as the Sistine Chapel? And I think that's less of the importance than the layering of meaning that you can tease out. This idea that, they're drawing from the Roman Missal and making the space into an illustrated book, an illustrated holy book, and drawing on their own experiences of Italian Renaissance art. They grew up around that art. And then layering it with things like modern mural design, or the adding in of these homesteads, where suddenly we have Mary being visited by Elizabeth in the Panhandle, right? So there's layers of meaning that make it more full of life and quality than if you just look at it and you say, well, that's not as good as Michelangelo. That's not the point for me.
And they say nothing interesting happens around here.
And I wonder if I might add
Absolutely, Warren.
the importance of art in this whole story, not only the very public art that's in the Church of St. Mary's, but the art the prisoners created and shared with members of the community. And you saw that mentioned in the film, and that's how Anne Cockrell, that's a big part of her story, because she received about a dozen paintings and drawings, and they're not great art, they're not even good art, maybe, some of them.
Hey, I would argue otherwise. I love some of those.
But they were important not only to the people the men who created them, but to her, because she kept these for the rest of her life. And other members of the community, I think, still have works of art that the prisoners created, maybe on display in their homes. And I think it's important to note that art can be that sort of universal language, to use a terrible cliche, but it's something that really draws people together.
Okay, so Warren, since you've brought up that element, and I think this is kind of how I wanted to bring our conversation to a close, not that we're done yet, but the darkness of this story. I know, Warren, you and I came back to that a lot. I think I've had this conversation with all three of you privately. The darkness of this story is very prevalent. I mean, this is a war story. These are prisoners. This is a dark telling. And yet, what we're focusing on is the creativity and the beauty and the personal relationships and a lot of the positive that came out of this. So how do you, I know, Warren, you and I especially had a conversation about how do you reconcile the light with the dark, the remembering it one way, and maybe is that really how an accurate retelling would be told? I mean, like, how do we reconcile that for ourselves?
Well, yes, and again, one of our aims in putting this exhibition together was to show those bonds that could be created out of dark times, and we wanted to emphasize that. But it's not to say that this was a story that was all sweetness and light, and the prisoners endured difficult conditions. You heard about their reduced rations and the things that they suffered as a result. But, you know, the one thing that I always think of is that the bonds that are created under circumstances like that, the difficulties of the times that everybody was facing with the uncertainties of war, and the fact that these men were being held as prisoners and all the anxieties that went with that, I think the bonds that are forged under circumstances like that are particularly lasting. And I think that's why you see these prisoners coming back so many years later and visiting this place, that you might think that this would be something they'd want to forget and never see again, but they came back. And because those bonds were because they were forged under those difficult circumstances, I think they were particularly lasting.
And that's, I think, an interesting point when we talk about memory. How does memory change over time, and how does our recollection change as we look back on something? I know, Michaela, that's something that you encountered a lot in talking just oral history through a lot of your research. So talk about that with us.
Right quick, just a side note.
Yes.
In the exhibit, there is a watercolor of the camp during the day, and right next to it, there's this drawing on black paper of the camp at night. And so we're already symbolically seeing these literally night and day, light and dark connections.
That's a really great point, yeah.
So, but everyone always is going to look at the past through rose-colored glasses. People look fondly, like even if you hated high school, for example, you're going to still have fond memories of high school. And you're not going to always remember the bad things that may have happened. And I think that is especially true whenever you're talking about such a much more traumatic experience like war, and not to compare war and high school together, that's crazy.
Sometimes it can feel like that.
Right, but bad example. But we're always going to try and find the good in things, and I think that is definitely present in this situation. And it is important to keep in mind that, especially when we're writing history about this afterwards, that we keep in mind that just because they look through it, make it seem good, like it was good, doesn't mean it necessarily was good.
And I think that's a really great point. Amy, am I looking at are you telling me with your face that you have something to add?
Something. So what I love about this night plus the exhibition is because it brings together two sides of a really important coin here. One is the archival evidence. You asked about memory. Like, how do we remember? Well, we remember through that gift giving that then creates an object that is stored in the family home and then gifted to a museum, right? So the tangible object. But then the PBS film captured oral histories, people talking. And sometimes these things run into, like, at odds with one another, right? Someone will tell a story and you're like, yeah, but the letter says this. No, but that's not how I remember it. And you're like, but it's written down. So, but that's the thing. Both of them are such vibrant forms of knowledge and history. And I will tell one story that I'm slightly annoyed about. So at WT, we have to declare this for this IRB board, whether we have subjects, like human subjects that we have to study. And Michaela and I discovered that we do not have to declare anything for oral history. There's a flow chart, and it starts out, it says, are you doing research? Yes, you go declare your stuff. Are you not doing research? No. Oral history is somehow not considered research. I think that that's really, really wrong. So I'll go up against that someday. But the point is that people's memories are so rich, even if our memories are fluid, and we need to hold on to those oral stories. And I love that film for that. But, you know, the idea that Michaela has heard the oral histories in her own family and then went to the archives and made the thesis out of both. And I think that that's such a powerful statement.
Yeah.
I also went back to who I could and tried to get another record of what they said, just to compare what they said in 2008 to what they said in 2020. In most cases, it was the same, but there were a little bit of difference, which I think is interesting because memory is still constantly changing.
Well, when I first started here in the Research Center, we were talking about how I could most effectively do my job, and one of the things that Renee, not Warren, but his colleague Renee told me was write it down. You think you'll remember it, but you won't. Mm-hmm. And it's a rule I now live my life by. That said, we are out of time, but I want to thank all of you for being here this evening. I think that our panelists had some really interesting comments and y'all had some great questions. Again, I want to thank Cullen Lutz with Panhandle PBS and Marcy Donovan, who is the film's producer, for joining us tonight. And of course, thank you to our panelists this evening. I also want to give a big shout out to Rachel Cantrell and Kristen Johnson from the PPHM staff. They have worked tirelessly to set this up for us, so I so appreciate their hard work. And of course, thank you to all of you for being here. I have talked entirely too long. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and please come back. Thank you so very much.